This is a Monster Craze blood supplement. I am your host, Ian Garcia. With Dracula having proved to be a life-saving success for Universal, the company and its vindicated president, Carl Laemmle Jr., were eager to capitalize with a follow-up as soon as possible, which ultimately led to the development of two projects, both of which would ostensibly star Bela Lugosi. First on the docket was Murders in the Rue Morgue, an adaptation of the short mystery story by Edgar Allan Poe. Concurrently, and soon taking precedence over Murders as attempts to fashion Poe's short story into a feature screenplay continued to languish in development, the studio was also developing an adaptation of Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, Frankenstein. Though in the public domain, the studio was less confident in creating an entirely new script from the book itself, and thus opted to also purchase the rights to Peggy Webling's 1927 play adaptation, which itself had been commissioned by Hamilton Dean after the success of Dracula, and had been recently revived in London to great success as early as 1930. George Melford, who had directed the Spanish-language version of Dracula, was attached to direct the film, whereas Lugosi was slated to play the lead role in the film, not the titular scientist as he had expected and hoped, but the monster. However, when Robert Florey was assigned to write the screenplay in late April, his contract effectively presented him with an open option to direct the film itself. And thus, Melford was shifted over to Murders in the Rue Morgue, and Robert Florey was now both writing and directing Frankenstein. Florey's original screenplay completely disregarded the philosophical elements of Shelley's novel, which were in turn inspired by the works of her father, William Godwin, one of the earliest proponents of modern political anarchism. Shelley's novel presents the monster as a tabula rasa, whose monstrous qualities are not expressed by his physical appearance, but are ultimately shaped by his experiences. Florey, on the other hand, consistent with the social Darwinism that was prominent in modern America, introduced the concept that the monster is guided by a faulty, criminal brain that predisposes him to brutality. Heavily inspired by German expressionist films, Florey patterned his conception of Frankenstein and his monster after The Golem and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, presenting a much more simplistic story of good and evil. The completed screenplay, submitted in June, with dialogue by Garrett Fort, was also extremely ambitious from a technical perspective, containing 600 discrete shots, including several sweeping movements that conveyed the sense of grandeur that Florey wanted to bring to the project, a far cry from Browning's stagey production of Dracula. During the tail end of our break period, we already had the opportunity to go over some of the behind-the-scenes drama concerning the development of Frankenstein in our September 5th episode on the 1933 British film, The Ghoul. Suffice it to say, Florey soon found himself moved off the project to take over Murders in the Rue Morgue, which was now being treated as a B production. Replacing him on Frankenstein was the ambitious British newcomer James Whale, who had managed to greatly impress Laemmle after delivering the hit wartime drama Waterloo Bridge on time and significantly under budget. Whale proceeded to put the entire production into turnaround, commissioning Francis Edward Farrago to perform significant rewrites on Florey and Fort's script, despite adhering to its overall structure, and particularly returning the monster to a more sympathetic portrayal consistent with the existential themes of Shelley's novel. And while the Laemmles were hesitant, sure that it was Bela Lugosi who had the most potential to be the industry's next Lon Chaney, Whale was convinced that he had discovered his Frankenstein's monster in the odd and almost sepulchral face and sallow and sad eyes of Boris Karloff. Hence, it would be necessary to finalize the look of Karloff as the monster before any official decision could be made. After shooting during the day on Graft, Karloff reported in the evenings to the studio of makeup artist Jack E. Pierce. It was Pierce who, having spent weeks studying human anatomy, surgery, medicine, and criminology, conceived of most of the essential components of the final monster design, such as the idea that Frankenstein would, quote, cut the top of the skull off straight across like a pot lid, hinge it, pop the brain in, and then clamp it on tight. He fashioned the enlarged forehead as if the brain was swollen and pushing against the skull, and a large scar on the right side of Karloff's head out of cheesecloth and cotton strips soaked in collodion, then added small metal clamps on either side. He also conceived of the idea of the monster having two metal stubs on either side of its neck, the method through which electricity would be conducted throughout its body. Karloff added that his eyes still appeared to normal and alive, so Pierce layered mortician's wax on his eyelids. It was Karloff who then had the idea to remove the dental bridge he wore on the right side of his mouth so that his cheeks would appear more sunken and cadaverous. For the body, Pierce added sutures and metal slats to Karloff's hands and wrists and covered all his exposed skin with a blue-green grease paint that would photograph as gray. He also took in the sleeves of Karloff's coat to make his arms appear longer than they were. He used a double-quilted suit to fill out the monster's torso, ran a steel rod along the actor's spine to make him more rigid, similarly stiffening his legs with steel struts, and finally fitted him with elevated asphalt spreaders boots that weighed 13 pounds each. It took 3 weeks for Pierce and Karloff to finalize the monster's look, but upon finally viewing a screen test of the actor in full garb, the Lemleys quickly realized that he was far more physically suited to the part than the rounder-faced Lugosi. On August 26th, Karloff was signed on to portray the monster. The final project was allotted a budget of $262,000 and a 30-day shooting schedule. The ambitious descriptor of Karloff as the next Lon Chaney proved to have a torturous double meaning, given Chaney's infamy for often putting himself through excruciating pain in order to perfect his physical appearance and performance as characters like Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera. While filming began at 9 a.m. each morning, Karloff would have to report to his dressing room 5 hours earlier so that he would be ready in time to shoot. In addition to adding the equivalent of 48 pounds to the actor's weight and the general discomfort of it, the padded clothing and heavy makeup were exceptionally hot. By lunch, the actor only had enough time for a Spartan meal in between stripping off his sweat-soaked undergarments and suit and replacing it with the afternoon standby. The mortician's wax also had a habit of drying out and falling into his eyes, which proved excruciatingly painful. At the end of the shooting day, Pierce would have to remove the collodion, cheesecloth, and other substances from Karloff's face using oils and acids, peeling everything off bit by bit. The actor would later compare the sensation to being skinned alive. On average, Karloff worked 15 to 16-hour days in full costume for roughly a month, except for September 28th and 29th, when Karloff worked a straight 25 hours, the production having fallen significantly behind schedule. By the end of shooting, the actor had lost 25 pounds. In addition to his years of manual labor, which at one point regularly involved lugging 100-pound bags of concrete as far as 50 yards, the arduous experience of making Frankenstein would contribute to Karloff having back problems that would last for the rest of his life. Principal photography on Frankenstein wrapped on October 3rd, 5 days over schedule and $35,000 over budget. When a finished edit of the film was finally previewed for the trade press on October 29th, the feedback immediately concerned the studio that Whale's original vision was simply too gruesome. No one could argue, as they had done for Browning's film, that the director had been delicate in his approach to the ultra-sensational subject matter. Of particular concern is the now notorious scene in which the monster encounters a little girl named Maria playing by a river, and accidentally drowns her when he assumes that she will float like the flowers. Universal also discovered that state censors in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York objected to Frankenstein's blasphemous line, "In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God." These sequences were significantly edited for some markets, and the original ending in which Frankenstein was killed by the monster was replaced by a tacked-on happy ending showing him recovering in the hospital. With the stricter enforcement of the production code in 1934, as was the practice at many studios, Universal literally removed the offending sequences from the original camera negative. It was thought for decades that these materials had been completely lost until they were rediscovered in the 1980s, preserved in the British National Film Archive. Future restored editions of Frankenstein have thus reincorporated these elements, meaning that modern viewers are privy to Whale's original vision in ways that many contemporary audiences were not. Unlike Boris Karloff, or William Henry Pratt as it were, James Whale, born in the summer of 1889, came from a working-class background. In his teenage years, his continued education became prohibitively expensive, and he therefore dropped out of school to become a cobbler. He realized early on, however, that he still had creative talent, and, to make extra money, sold nails recovered from replaced soles for scrap, eventually allowing him to pay for evening classes at the Dudley School of Arts and Crafts. At the outbreak of the First World War in the summer of 1914, he voluntarily enlisted and was subsequently made a second lieutenant of the Worcestershire Regiment 2 years later. He was taken as a prisoner of war in Flanders a year after that, and was held at the Holzminden officers' camp until the end of the conflict. There, Whale ironically found much reprieve acting in, producing, writing, and designing sets for amateur theater productions. Developing a knack for poker in the meantime, he was able to finance his re-entry into civilian life once repatriated in December 1918 by cashing in the chits and IOUs he had amassed from his fellow POWs. At first trying his hand at cartooning, Whale soon found himself working his way up in the theater. His first great success came in 1928, as the director of the Incorporated Stage Society's production of R.C. Sheriff's Journey's End, a drama detailing the experiences of a British Army infantry company in the trenches of San Quentin before the fateful Operation Michael, the opening bombardment of which kills all of the play's central characters. The play ran for 3 years to uniform critical praise and great financial success, and Whale himself directed the Broadway production produced by Gilbert Miller. Around this time, Hollywood was moving from silent to sound film, and were thus particularly keen on acquiring performers and directors experienced with dialogue. Whale soon found himself a dialogue director, notably directing new sequences for Howard Hughes's Hell's Angels when the impulsive mogul decided at the last minute to convert the wartime epic into a talkie. He also found himself a natural choice to direct a film adaptation of Journey's End, co-produced by the British Gainsborough Pictures and the American Tiffany Pictures from late December 1929 to early January 1930. As with the play, the film was a huge commercial and critical success, and shortly thereafter, Whale signed an exclusive 5-picture deal with Universal. Frankenstein was only Whale's second film for Universal, and his third film overall. But despite its production difficulties, the final product is more polished and demonstrates a significantly more sophisticated aesthetic sensibility than Browning's Dracula. In some ways, Whale and Browning's approaches to their respective projects were quite similar. Just as Browning had done with Fort's Dracula script, Whale had ignored Florey's original, ostentatious vision in favor of a more straightforward, theatrical drama. And just as with Browning and Freund, Whale and cinematographer Arthur Edison, teaming again after Waterloo Bridge, took significant cues from German Expressionism, with Whale specifically noting that he wanted Frankenstein's laboratory itself to look like something out of Metropolis. What's more, Frankenstein, just like Dracula before it, other than the opening credits, features no accompanying music score. Nonetheless, the results couldn't be more different. Though they had both worked in theater, Whale's experiences were less provincial and vaudevillian than Browning, and he was consequently more adept at traditional drama. And as opposed to the psychosexual and visceral fascination with the occult reflected in Dracula, Whale's vision of Frankenstein is much more appropriately in tune with the philosophical significance of Shelley's novel. Working in concert with Karloff, Whale presents a monster who is tragic rather than pernicious, as an ignorant child deserted by his god who only lashes out because he is neglected and abused. On the other hand, whereas Browning is primarily attracted to the weird, Whale does not shy away from the gruesome. Rather than contradicting his intellectual investment in the subject matter, the most morbid and ghoulish aspects of the film accentuate its specific themes, which makes it even more tragic that these elements were suppressed for so long. An excellent example of this instinct, which remained in the film as originally released, is the revelation of the monster itself. In the sequence, Karloff backs into the room, only slowly turning to the camera to reveal his face to the light. Whale then cuts to a close-up of Karloff looking directly into the camera, his head taking up the whole frame. Then, Whale cuts in even closer so that the actor's face takes up the entire screen, not only surprising the audience with an even closer view of his ugliness, but also accentuating Karloff's facial performance, especially his drooping, sad, pathetic eyes. Though theatrical, Whale demonstrates a keener awareness of the ways in which the rules of filmmaking can be manipulated and sometimes even broken in order to provoke the spectator. This, in turn, leads us to the final crucial distinction between Frankenstein and Dracula. Whale implements a far greater number and variety of shots than Browning. Whale's direction specifically demonstrates the importance of the close-up in not only emotionally involving the spectator, but also in breaking up the rhythm of the drama and making things livelier. Whale will even sometimes begin scenes in close-up before then cutting to the master shot, the opposite of classical Hollywood convention. Though a relative newcomer to film, Whale already displays significantly more facility with the cinematic medium, particularly sound film, than Browning does. Further, it is Frankenstein, with its synthesis of sensational content and social commentary, that foreshadows the platonic ideal of future horror films, all the way from Val Lewton's work at RKO to the new horror that emerged from the late 60s through the 70s. Whale's own style of theatricality also gives Frankenstein a somewhat black comic, self-aware tinge that would be accentuated further in the director's subsequent horror films, The Old Dark House the following year, The Invisible Man in 1933, and Bride of Frankenstein in 1935. In addition to its moral and existential themes, the film can be read from the perspective of its troubled scientist as a commentary on art and the nature of creation. At one point early on in the film, Frankenstein even characterizes his experiment to give life to his creation as a scene, and the other characters consequently as sane spectators. Through these characterizations, we can perceive not only Whale's flair for showmanship, but also the extent to which the film functions as an allegory for the artist or showman. The artist desires nothing more than for his work to be the perfect realization of what he conceives. But once the work is completed, he risks being misunderstood by his audience, or even vilified as a madman or degenerate if he pushes them too far to accept things that are gruesome or unusual to them. Worse, the work itself is only ever a compromised, perverse, or imperfect realization of what the artist dreamed, or may even reveal aspects of themselves that the artist does not want to face. That's going to do it for your Monster Craze Blood Supplement. Please join us this weekend as we follow up our discussion of Dracula with Universal Pictures' second horror film from 1931, James Whale's Frankenstein.